Hi everyone, welcome to the video. Today I am interviewing Zoe Burgess, author of Song of the Night. I have to admit my copy only arrived this morning, so I've not got very far with it yet. But we will talk about your book. But for now, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Right, so hi, I'm Zoe Burgess. This is my first novel. It took me about 10 years to finally get it published, but I'm happy it's out there. It is I call it a paranormal homoerotic romance set in a dystopian future.
Cool. So, in terms of you homoerotic, there is it sort of an adult? Is it quite erotica, or is it aimed at teen sort of paranormal romance, young adult? What sort of audience
I've
are you expecting to like it, I guess?
I've definitely aimed it at kind of like an older. It's not for teen,
Yeah.
just because the characters aren't teenagers. Um, it's not like overly erotic, but there is like sex in it. So definitely not for anyone under the age of consent, let's say.
Very,
And kind of a bit violent as well.
yeah. Strangely enough, people seem to care less about the violence and the murder in things
Yeah,
than people that might have consensual sexual acts. But
yes. It's like the sex scene is a consensual sex scene, but there is definitely lots of non-consensual violent acts where people don't want to be beaten up and eaten.
yeah. I have to say, I find it quite interesting just reading the prologue of this, because you have a character who, let's just say, feels fairly possessive. He wants to sort of own this other person,
Yeah.
but there's also a couple of lines in there about he doesn't want to take him. He wants it to be mutual, and I just think that's interesting because you get some tropes in the sort of paranormal romance genre where things that are fairly non-consensual or consensually iffy get almost romanticized, and it is quite interesting to have that right from the start, the desire for consent.
Yes. Well, I mean, I came up through the yaoi genre. I'm a big anime fan girl, and yaoi was a big thing for me. But I wanted it to be more consensual. So I liked like overpowering, possessive, non-human characters such as my main vampire, but at the same time, the self-awareness of knowing that because they're otherworldly doesn't give them the right to take whatever they want, and he actually wants something more mutual than just sating his desire and his obsessions.
No, I think that's interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out. I'm also interested in talking about the sort of the gender identity of Uren. Am I saying that
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
because the character's sort of described as he pronouns in the blurb and talks
yeah,
about how he is really a man, but there's also talking about how he became a woman to please his mother, and that sort of how gender affects this character, I think, is quite an
yeah.
interesting approach. So, any comments on that?
So it's really hard to explain because when I originally wrote this book, things like gender identity and trans rights weren't as prolific. And I wrote into this story all the characters are aspects of myself and just all dealing with various things I dealt with, like gender identity and like having the tiger mother and the need to please, but also trying to feel desirable, but then thinking it's wrong to feel like that. Yui Ren always is male and tried to please, but then discovered that there are different ways to be male or masculine. And like myself, it's more of a gender fluid thing. You can have a biological sex and you can have a sexuality and you can have a gender, but they're not always kind of, and how to explain it.
So,
They're not easy
gender
to find.
gender expression and gender identity are not always sort of 100% equal. That sort
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Yes.
It's interesting, and again, I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes within the book. You talked about the yaoi genre. Is there a particular inspiration for this book, or is it more general?
It's more general, I think. Like, strangely enough, I haven't read that much vampire yaoi compared to. I mean, I liked a lot of like fantasy yaoi, And because I got, being older, I got very bored with the high school romances, and like, can we have some older male characters, a bit of age of consent to, and a bit of like, and I do like my vampires and things. And I used to adore things like Angel Sanctuary. Yamane Matsue were big influences on my visual style as I saw the world like coming together, and things like the works of Yoshiaki Kawajiri and Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. So there was those kind of like visual influences, and I just really wanted more queer fiction because I just felt there wasn't enough.
You wanted to see yourself reflected more. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Okay. You said this is sort of about 10 years this story's taken. Is that in
Yeah.
terms of from the sort of the first inkling of the idea, or from the first draft of what was the process for writing it?
Yes, goodness, it's been so long ago. I remember it literally just, I had a dream one night and I started writing it. And then I just wanted a story about vampires and demons and conflict in a different setting. And it just appeared. And I would just see the characters in everyday life. And then I read a couple of Anne Rice novels and I was like, I like some of this style. And then I fell in love with an author called Poppy Z. Bright and then Holly Black. And I just like that alternate, dark, more erotic kind of world that you could create. And I just wanted to put something out there that was in that vein, but with more of my kind of splashes. And then weirdly enough, some of the letters that Yui Ren writes in it were actual letters that when I was really like going for a lot of depression and anxiety, I wrote myself. And then I remember finding them and going, oh my goodness. So these could be Yuri Ren's, and therefore I could also get that stuff I was going from out in this book as well. And it started turning into a way for me to explore my gender, my history with depression, and my visual interests, and also the fact that I like yaoi and slash.
So you get to vent a bit as well as create.
Yes.
No, that's nice. I mean, this is obviously the first book you've had published, but have you written a lot of other stories?
I mean, I wrote a lot of like short kind of stories back in my younger days. Strangely enough, I wrote and have a lot of non-fiction because I also research anime, and I'm putting together like papers and dissertations generally in the world of like gender and social commentary. So I'm very much firmly into the academia. And then I started writing fan fiction, and I thought, oh, I like this, I enjoy this, but actually I'd like to write something more than just fan fiction. I would like to create my own worlds.
But sort of starting off with sort of playing in somebody else's sandbox and going, no, I'm going to make my whole playground.
Yes.
No, that's nice. Yeah. In terms of authors, you've mentioned a few authors that write in a similar sort of style. Are there any others that you feel particularly inspire you, or you particularly admire for one reason or another?
I always think like I'm not a well-round reader. I'm dyslexic, and so reading was out the window for me for ages. So I had to truly connect to someone to be able to read their works. And I absolutely adored Poppy Z. Bright because her books were dark, a bit nasty, but erotic, and like just something I got really into. I adored Holly Black because she was one of the few people, and Melissa Marr, that wrote about fae, paranormal romance, instead of just like vampires. And even though they were teen writers, they weren't doing what Twilight was, which was just too romantic and nonsensical for me. But mostly I really love manga and anime and the visual worlds created in that kind of era. So Clamp is a big inspiration for me. In my head, the character designs for Yui Ren look very much like the character Yui in Cardcaptor Sakura.
Right. Yeah, and in turn, I'm just wondering if you listen to many audiobooks, because I think Holly Black, I've listened to her audiobooks. I don't think I've actually read any of her books sort of physically. So I just wonder.
Yeah, I've got really into audiobooks recently. Yeah. Like, I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I can get through so much. And I started off with things that I knew. So I did all of Harry Potter, Then I've just listened to goodness knows how many for Rick Riordan and the Percy
Oh,
Jackson.
right, yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I like these. I do like teen fiction and young adult stuff, like, because I also like things. I like the Hunger Games, and I really like the one with the children and the wall and the horrible slug mutant monsters, and then
Maze Runner?
yes, that's it. That's it. I was really big into that. And I
That's
do
one of
like,
those where I think whoever made the film disliked the same, had the same annoyances with the book that I did, because they seem to
yeah,
have cut the bits that annoyed me when they did the film adaptation of it.
yeah. And they cast it really
Oh,
well.
yeah.
And it was just like, this is really good. It was a shame that it took so long for the last part because the hype had died down. But
Yeah.
as far as that genre, I love that kind of like dystopian, dissatisfied youth culture genres as well. Um,
I find that young adult tends to play with genres a bit more than adult
yeah,
fiction. I mean, there's obviously exceptions out there, but when it comes to things that sort of aren't quite sci-fi, aren't quite fantasy, that are just sort of blurring the lines between different genres, young adult seems to be where that freedom
yeah.
lies.
They know a lot more about like genre hybridization,
Yeah.
which is again what I like about the anime industry. It's hybridizing genres and putting
Mhm.
things together. And yeah, I like that. I don't think a sci-fi needs to be a strict sci-fi. And I always wondered why like all paranormal stuff and all our vampires are either now or the past. And I'm like, vampires are going to exist in the future. Like,
Vampires in space.
yeah, exactly. I want that. Werewolves of the moon. There we go, that kind of thing. And it's like, I just believe these other races and powers will still be there in different settings. And as humanity kind of like gets more towards the dystopias, what's all the supernatural creatures going to be doing when the Hunger Games is hitting? Like, where are all they going to be? Because they've got to be doing something.
No, it's interesting to just sort of play with these ideas and sort of see where they go.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of your writing, do you have a sort of process for writing? Do you sort of sit down at a certain time of day? Do you sort of plan things out or in a certain way, or do you just sort of see what happens?
I'm terrible that I've never planned anything. Like I literally be sit in front of the laptop and be like, go, idea came out. Ooh, end of idea. Oh, that'll be a chapter then. I'm very much a first thing in the morning person.
Hmm.
I used to get up and by about 7 o'clock I was on the laptop, and by like 9 o'clock I'd written like 4,000 words and went, cool. What should I do with the rest of the day now? I feel like I've got that out of me. I then got a cat, and if ever been a cat owner, having a small kitten while you're trying to write is impossible. So that was a bit like, oh no, my writing process is now, I try typing cat now fights for dominance over the laptop. Um, but yeah. Um, and then yeah, it just the idea unfolds as I'm writing it, and I always tell myself the characters tell me the story,
Mm.
because you just kind of slip into that, because the way I write is very much from the characters' points of view, and they just tell me their story, and I've just got to type it all down and then try and get someone who's better at spell check than I am to make sure the grammar makes sense.
Yeah. So what was the publishing process for it?
The publishing process was
Yeah.
probably the bit that took the longest. I think out of the 10 years, it probably took about 7 years to publish. I wrote a vast amount of this when I was still living in South Korea. So first I had to wait until I got back to the West. And I started off writing it as a story for me and another friend of mine, that at the time we were really into supernatural, and we just finished Buffy and Angel, and we were like, I wish there were more shows that had these plots, but people were gay in them. And then by the time I'd finished writing it, I'm like, I actually have a book here. And so I started trying to research publishers that published like horror, paranormal romance, and I was rejected for years because no one wanted to touch anything with a queer romance. And they were just like, oh, it's not for us. Oh, it's not for us. Oh, it's not for us. And I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to get there. And then I remember it's been 2 years now, I went to Birmingham Collectomania because I'm a geek and I love my collectomanias, and I was running around happily meeting John Barrowman for God the 25th time or something. And then I always love going down the artist alley in the comic zones to see what other people are creating. And there was this publishers called Britain's Next publisher, and I just went up to them and started chatting, going, how do people submit for you and what kind of work do you publish? And we got chatting and they were like, no, your idea sounds really interesting, you know, send us a proposal and stuff. And what we normally do is we will set you up a Kickstarter and grow you a fan base. But they got the work, they enjoyed it, and then they just published it. And I was like, ooh, wait, I was planning on doing a whole Kickstarter campaign and trying to work out how I was going to get people interested in my book. But they had enough faith in it that they were like, no, we like this story and it's something different and it's something, you know, enjoyable. And yeah.
I think it is interesting how much things have changed in terms of seeing queerness in fiction, because I remember shortly, it must have been about 8 or 9 years ago, I was working on the first draft of a thing and was basically told to scrap the idea because I'd never find a mainstream publisher for a book that involved two teenage boys falling in love as sort of the main romance of the story.
Yeah.
And that was sort of, not all that long ago, and yet now there's a lot more publishers open to the ideas, publishers that are specifically seeking out sort of more representative fiction, which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed as one of the reasons I fell in love with the YA genre is all the good representation was in YA. All the good females, all the good like queer stories, and more stories about ethnic characters were all there. And I was like, I'm not going to read any adult fiction. They don't have anything for me in it. And I'm like, maybe I'm just weird because, like, you know, I'm a dyslexic, dyspraxic, mixed-raced, Asian, pansexual, gender fluid person. And I'm like, I'm a bit unique, but there's not going to be the average, like, you know, half Scottish, half Malay, you know, pan character in your novel. I mean, one day I do feel, please, we need more Asians in things. But it is nice how it's ticking over, and then generations that are younger than us can actually have that fiction that they can relate to, because I related to nothing and I couldn't read very well. And I was like, well, if I can't read and there's nothing I want to read, I'm going to give up. But then, I was pulled back into it by good YA fiction.
No, and I think there's still a long way to go, but I think sort of it is changing for the better.
Yes.
Yeah. So on the subject of the future, is there anything you're working on at the moment? Any new stories coming out?
I'm working on the sequel. Yep. So it's got a sequel in the works, but I'm only like 5 chapters in. I've only just started working on the sequel.
So hopefully we won't have to wait another 10 years.
Oh, goodness. Well, now that I've got a publisher, I just need to write it and get it proofread. But I've got faith that I can do that within the next 10 years. So I want to do that. And then I'm working on another idea that's very early stages. I always, some unknown reason, I do 2 things first. I draw all the characters that are going to be in the story, so I know what they look like. So when they start telling me their stories, I can put a face to the voice. It makes me sound like a mad person. I can put a face to the voice that's telling me the story as I write it.
We're writers. We understand.
Yeah. So I will draw them all out, and then I will either like draw a map or something just so I know where they live and a bit about their world. Mm-hmm. So I do a bit of that. And then the story, once they start telling me. So my other one that's very much in the character design, because these characters want to know, something called Vampire Squid, which is a Lovecraftian homoerotic story.
I'm sure Lovecraft would have been thrilled.
I know. Just really wanted hot tentacles and adult fiction.
No, I think there's a friend of mine from uni who would have gotten really, really well with you, who like tentacle things.
Oh.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to find out more about you or your writing, where should they go?
So for my writing, I use the Let Zoe Spoil You on Twitter. And then for my arts, if you ever want to see the character designs from the books, I use it's Let Zoe Spoil You Creates, or I think it's Zoe_let on Twitter, for depending on which project you want to follow. I do most of my blogging there. Song of the Night does have a Facebook page, so if you just type in Song of the Night into Facebook, it's updating slowly, and I've got a Patreon, which again is Let Zoe Spoil You.
I'll put the links to that in the video description.
Cool.
So thank you for your time.
Cool. Thank you.